friends, welcome to the Three Pillars podcast with your host Griselda Barreto. Aviation. Today's guest is Daniel Dumalin. Daniel has a license in experimental and theoretical psychology. He is a research psychologist. Today, this is called a Master of Science in Experimental and Theoretical Psychology. He also has an associate's degree in electronic engineering and biomedical engineering. As a specialization, he followed separate courses in biomedical electronics, which is part of an M.Sc program in electronics and ICT engineering technology, and biomedical product development and neuromodulation and imaging, which are part of the M.Sc program in biomedical engineering. He also has 29 years experience in IT as a software developer, a web developer, and a system administrator. Daniel has been a board member of the section Neuroscience and Psychophysiology from 2017 up to the present. From 2012 to 2017, in the section Psychophysiology, he was an organization position board member and technical advisor until it merged into the section Neuroscience and Psychophysiology. He also was a part of QNBG, which is the Quantified Neurophysiology Belgium group, from 1999 to 2005 as scientific and technical coordinator. Hi Daniel, welcome to the Three Pillars. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Okay, it's great to have you on. I'm so honored to have you on the show, and I've been waiting for a long time to speak with you. I know you're very busy, isn't it?
Yes, I have. At least the past 2 weeks have been very busy.
Yeah, and how come the last 2 weeks did something change?
Well, it did change after the article was published talking about my preliminary result and my appeal for more subjects for my study. We had the past couple of weeks a constant stream of emails from across the globe, people who wanted to participate in my study.
Wow. So how many do you have for the moment?
Well, after about a week, I think we already got the 50 subjects we wanted to have, but it keeps coming, so I think we'll be beyond 50 now.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, before we go any further, we'll go back to all of this later on. Can I ask you to tell our listeners something about yourself?
Well, I'm the kind of person who thinks that action speaks louder than words, and that's why I like to tell a bit more about myself by talking about the path that I have been following, which led me to where I'm now in time and place. Where did my journey start? Well, it already started as a student. I was a psychology student at the time and was interested in doing scientific research. And this was also the period that there was a lot of hype around the paranormal and parapsychology. And even in the first year, some of my colleagues, we came together and started a work group on the paranormal and parapsychology because there was a lot of things we heard and a lot of criticism on that. You had two sides. You had the believers and the non-believers. And the non-believers were called the skeptics. And we felt from the psychological point of view that this was an interesting subject. And we positioned us in the middle and we called ourselves critical. So we wanted to hear both sides and find out what was true for all the things that happened. But for myself, specifically, I joined the work group because I was also interested in altered states of consciousness. And in one of the meetings that we organized, I met a neuropsychiatrist who was also interested in altered states of consciousness. And we started talking. And there I found out that she did sleep research. And she had also done sleep research on astronauts on the Skylab. And one of the astronauts was the Dutch astronaut Wubbo Ockels. So I was very interested because in one of our courses we had talked about EEG and that piqued my interest. So we started talking and it was all very interesting because I was also interested in astronomy and spaceflight. So we had different subjects that caught my attention. And we kept in contact. And a few years later, when I had to find a place for my internship, I thought, hey, maybe maybe I can do something in her lab. So I asked her, could I do my internship at your lab? And she said, yes, no problem. And luckily, the university agreed that I could my internship there. And there I had my first encounter with neurophysiology, sleep research. And unknowingly at the time, that would open a door to my future in neurophysiology. And what happened a few years later, after my about finished my military service, I was called up by a colleague, and he was working at the hospital in Ostend, where I'm still now. And he said, well, there are two neuropsychiatrists who had bought a QEEG machine, and they're looking for someone who would be interested to run the lab. As I was interested in neurophysiology, I said, yes, okay. I came over. We had a very nice interview, and quickly after, they let me know that I was the right candidate for it. And I started working there. And after 29 years, I'm still there.
That's an amazing story. That is truly interesting. So, you mentioned the terminology neurophysiology, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What can you explain to the listeners very simply, because I know it's quite a technical term? What does it actually mean?
Well, neurophysiology is all about the nervous system. And the nervous system are mainly two parts. We have the central nervous system, that's the brain, and we have the peripheral nervous system, and that's essentially the wires that connect the rest of the body to the brain. So that makes us able to see, hear, walk, stand up without falling over. And specifically, neurophysiology will study the nervous system by measuring the electrical activity of the nerves. And basically, there are two techniques that are used for that. We have the evoked potentials and we have the EEG. The EEG is used for measuring the electrical activity of the brain, and the evoked potentials are used to measure the peripheral nerves. So basically what we do is we put some electrodes on the brain, and then we can give the patient some stimuli. For example, we could use light flashes to test if there's something wrong with the visual system. We can use sound to see if there's something wrong with the hearing system. And there are many other techniques where we can study the different kind of nerves that run through our body. And the EEG is basically we put more electrodes on the brain. That's about 20. That's the basic. But in research, that could go up to 256. And the EEG started in 1936 by Hans Berger and has been used ever since. It's still used in neurology. So that's what you see when you record an EEG is the traces. You can compare it if you see the signal of sound. It looks a bit the same, but the frequencies, so the speed of the waves is different. And from this, we can determine in very general terms if there's something wrong with the brain. And later on, that developed to QEEG, quantified EEG, where we are able, thanks to the development of computers, extract data from these signals that we can't see with the human eye. And what's particularly important in QEEG is that we can compare this data with a norm group, so with an age group, and by this we can exactly determine where there are differences. That's why we call it quantified EEG.
Okay, so you spoke about QEEG. I'm presuming it's an important terminology. Has it been important towards your research?
Certainly, it is, I would say, very important because it allows you also to localize inside the brain where the electrical activity that you measure on the surface comes from. And thanks to scientific studies, we know which functions are attached to each brain area, but also we can determine for what brain areas need to work together to perform certain functions. For example, if you want to grab a cup of coffee, you need your eyes, you need your hands. We need a whole system that needs to communicate without any problem in order to do that.
Wow, so it's quite a complex process. Tell me, Daniel, how does all this that you've just explained to us, how does it connect with aerotoxic, and how did your journey begin with aerotoxic?
My journey in aerotoxic started with the first flight attendant that was referred to me by a trauma specialist, and that's about a year ago. He was already familiar with the way I work on the QEG, and that my approach is a more in-depth analysis, because I also integrate the results of the QEG with PET and MRI. So in order to get a more complete image of what is going wrong in the brain. And that first flight attendant is an example of one of the flight attendants who are in a very bad state. She has been sick since 1969.
Wow.
She's unable to function properly. She really lives isolated. She has very sensitive to sound and light, so she has to put down the shutters. So she's really living in isolated in her home. Luckily for her, she has a very supportive social network, so that she can have some kind of life, but it's very limited in what she can do. So she was referred to me, and there was no mention of aerotoxic. It was just mentioned that her problems could be related to the conditions on the airplane. So my first step was to see the results of our QEG, and when I saw them, I also wanted to explain why she had all these differences in compared to the age group. So I started to get more backgrounds. So first I went for the technical background in planes. So what's the condition really there on board, to better understand where these problems could come from. And as I learned more, I came across the term bleed air. So I learned that the cabin air is coming from the engines. And when I researched bleed air more, I came across the word aerotoxic. And as I went further on my path to find out more, I found out a lot of people, basically international, who were already trying to make people aware of the problem that exists in the aviation industry. But that was very interesting to learn all these things. So I got a clear picture of what was going on, but I still wanted to explain my results. So I focused now my attention to research that was done into the aerotoxic problem. And to my disappointment, I found out that not many scientific studies had been done, and especially not QEG. The things that I found about QEG were from the 70s and the 80s, so not using the more developed QEG that we now use today. So I wanted to explain the results, but also the flight attendant wanted to make a legal case. So I needed really to explain what was causing all these problems and make a link to the toxic air in the cabin. So the only way I could do that was to see more flight attendants, pilots. So I already had found a lot of groups who were active on aerotoxic. So I contacted them and asked the question, do you know anybody in Belgium that can make me get more subjects, volunteers who want to participate in my study? And two different groups pointed me to the same person. I contacted her, and she spread the word that I was looking for volunteers to find out if there was anything common in the QEG results of flight attendants. And that started my first subjects. And to my surprise, I rather quickly found a common pattern, and this piqued the interest of many people. One of the group that got interested in my results was the people of Flyware. So they asked to come over, I explained my results, and they quickly decided that they wanted to cooperate with me. And then, well, only a few weeks later, I was contacted by a Belgian journalist who had published quite a few articles on the aerotoxic syndrome, and we talked about my results. He found it very interesting and told me I would also like to publish an article about your research. But he still had to publish one other article about also a very sick flight attendant. And then I thought nothing of it, so say, okay, we will see. And then out of the blue, it all happened very quickly. He contacted me on Friday. He told me it's a good time to publish the article on Monday. I will send over a photographer and we will do the interview on Sunday. And the article was published. From then on, it went crazy.
You're famous now.
Well, instead of the 7 volunteers I had, I will have plenty of volunteers, and And it will be an international study because people who are joining the study are coming from across the globe. I have candidates who will fly over from Australia, Canada. We have Iceland, Slovenia, so from everywhere.
Wow. I think we've just found the missing link. Aerotoxic victims have been campaigning for years now to show that there is something wrong with the cabin air that's affecting them. And you have just given them proof. And I must say, I did read this article that you are talking about that came out like a week ago or a couple of days ago. And something that you said really hit me. And I think it hit many people. It was just that one line which, said so much about you as a person. And I think you know what I'm talking about. But that line that you said, I want to fight for all those people, is amazing. Because now you've just shown that you care for their cause. So you're going to get many more, I think, people contacting you to help them out and to find a reason why they've been feeling the way they've been feeling. So, yeah, you're doing amazing work, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if we go a bit further now, could you explain to us basically how you do this testing on your, let's say, victims or the people who are suffering from aerotoxic?
Well, it all starts with putting on a cap where all the electrodes are already attached. That used to be separate, but now you just put on the cap and the electrodes are in its place. But we still have to use some gel to make a connection between the skull and the electrodes in the cap. And the examination consists basically of 5 parts. 2 parts are QEEG, so we record an EEG with eyes open and eyes closed. And then we have cognitive evoked potentials, 3 different kinds, and basically all 3 consists of a noise where the subject has to press a button. But this could be combined with light flashers. And in 2 parts of the evoked potentials, the subject doesn't know when he needs to press the button. And in one evoked potential, the subject is warned that the target sound where he has to press the button will arrive in about 1.5 seconds. After we have done all these recordings, there's also some post-processing that need to be done. And for the QEEG, that's basically removing all the signals that are not coming from the brain. And in most cases, that's eye movements, that could be eye blinks, and could also be muscle artifacts. Why is that? Well, basically, we're recording the brain which is locked up in a box, and in between the skull and the electrodes there are muscles, and muscles also generate electrical activity. And because they are on the surface, the signal is much larger than from the brain. So we need to remove that in order to get a reliable result on the QEEG analysis. And then we compare the calculated analysis with the normative group, so we can really pinpoint where there are any deviations from normal. And then the next step is try and link all the complaints, the symptoms, to the results of the QEEG and the event-related potentials. And because this is a scientific study, we also have to compare each individual QEEG to find common patterns, but also if there are differences, trying to explain these differences and where are they coming from.
Okay. I also know that you've worked a lot with the traumatic brain injury patients. Could you tell us the similarities or differences between aerotoxic syndrome sufferers and traumatic brain injury sufferers?
Well, one of the main similarities are the cognitive problems that they are experiencing. In both cases, the symptoms can be quite varied, but they're all cognitive systems, functions that are impaired. So that's one similarity, but there are also some differences, and they are also common in both. What I've noticed in patients with traumatic brain injury, that some patients succeed putting in place what I call compensation mechanisms. So in order to compensate for the cognitive problems that they experience. Some people have it, some people haven't. And I see the same thing with aerotoxic patients. So on the cognitive side, there are a lot of similarities. And why is that? Because from my experience, experiences with traumatic brain injuries, my idea is that the arotoxic syndrome is also a brain injury. The cause is different. For traumatic brain injury, this could be a fall, a motor vehicle accident, a blow to the head. And in arotoxic, it's the toxins that damage the brain. And why is that? In most brain injuries, you have what we call the primary injury. That's in effect the cause, what caused it. But then you have secondary injuries, and it's these secondary injuries that makes there's a lot of common results in both groups. But there's a very important difference. We know in traumatic brain injury that no two concussions are alike. They all have different kind of results. There are some similarities, but they're all quite different. In the arotoxic, there's a common pattern that is recurring in every individual. There are differences, but we have a common pattern. This is not the case in traumatic brain injury. That's why I'm very excited by that, and the fact also that I found it so quickly.
And so, what have you learned then from your results?
Well, I've learned that my hypothesis that I had that the arotoxic is also a brain injury seems to be confirmed. So that's a very good thing. And I also learned that I could explain the results and make a link to the toxins that are on board of the airplane. And these toxins are organophosphates, and better known in the area of pesticides, but also nerve gas.
And why are these dangerous? What is the harmful effect that it's having on the brains and on the cognitive system of that person?
Well, what these toxins do is they damage one of the systems that are active in the brain, and it's called, in this case, the cholinergic system. And basically what it does, it stops the different chemicals, and specifically the chemical that prevents the breakdown of these chemicals, which are used for communication in between the nerves. And we get a lot of these chemicals, and that means that things started to go wrong and eventually will cause damage. And that starts with one area that's very sensitive. That means that there are a lot of cholinergic fibers in that area, so they are the most sensitive, and that will be the first symptoms that will appear. And the areas that I found are specifically the areas that are linked to cognitive function. That's why you have this common pattern, because in these areas there's a lot of these fibers.
So, how does this show on the person in reality?
Well, he will have problems with concentration. He will be sensitive to sound. He will have difficulty integrating information from the different sensors. That means he will have difficulty to perform his tasks. He will have some memory problems. So basically, all the cognitive functions we need in order to perform any task that we perform in our daily life, in our personal life, but also on the job.
Which is amazing because, in aviation, it's drilled into cabin crew members' daily training that if ever there was an emergency to take place on board of an aircraft, they are given just 90 seconds to react and to evacuate the aircraft. 90 seconds. So I'm just imagining now if somebody did have this brain injury, let's say, because of aerotoxic, and they were put into an emergency situation, would they be able to react in those 90 seconds and save everyone on board of that aircraft?
They will have a very hard time to perform that fast in an emergency, because one of the effects is because you need to integrate all your senses together, and that needs to be able to do very quickly. But this will be impaired. Everything will go a lot slower in the brain, and 90 seconds is very short, and it's very likely that they will have a hard time. Maybe some will succeed in doing it, but others will struggle to do it.
Wow. Yeah, my God, this is crazy, huh? This is,
Yeah.
unbelievable, actually. So tell me, Daniel, are you aware of any measures that can mitigate the damage? Like, are there certain diets we can follow or things we can do to improve or cope better when you are in this kind of a situation?
Well, let's go back first to brain injury, and because it's common for any brain injury. whatever the cause. When an injury occurs, the brain will try and repair itself. And in order to do that, it will need the necessary nutrients, which nutrients are important for the nerves to heal. There are a few vitamins. One important vitamin is B12 and B6. There's also vitamin D, which is also very important. And what's also important is cholesterol. It's not that bad as they claim, because if we look in the body, 20% of our cholesterol is in the brain. The brain really needs it to be healthy. So thinking about that, these nutrients are especially needed for the daily repair of our brain, and especially when there's a brain injury, there will be a need for more nutrients. And what I've seen through the years, because I regularly see blood labs of patients, and I've noticed that through the years, I've seen many more people who are deficient in or have low vitamin B12 and vitamin D. So no wonder that they have problems and they suffered no injury or whatever. But if your brain hasn't enough nutrients, it will be unable to repair itself on a daily basis. So that's why it's especially important in case of a brain injury. So you should get these nutrients from your diet. But what is the problem with our current diet, which is known as the Western diet, which is, well, mostly for some people fast food and industrial prepared food, and they are very deficient in some nutrients. Some of the industrial prepared foods, they supplement it with it, but what's the problem there? They want to do it cheap, and in most cases this will be synthetic vitamins or minerals, and that means that it will be hard for the body to absorb them. So basically you will only get a very small part of it in your body, so you will not have the nutrients necessary for your brain. So that's not surprising that people of today, especially young people, are either very low or deficient in some of their vitamins. So what kind of diet could help you to get more nutrients inside? Well, in my studies of diets, and I've tried many myself in search for a better diet, and about 10 years ago I found a diet that was very surprising to me. This was the first diet. It's called Paleo Diet, or some call it the Neanderthal diet. What kind of diet is that? Basically, that's a diet that was in very long time ago, before agriculture started. That was the kind of diet that they had. So basically, it consists of meat, fish, vegetables, and a small amount of fruit. So no potatoes, no rice, no bread, no milk products. So you could say it's very limited. Many people will have a problem with that. I understand that. But what convinced me to stay on that diet, and I feel the effect every day, is the fact that after 1 week starting this diet, I felt my energy level was up. That was the first time I had tried many diets, the first diet that gave me that effect. And for me, that was it. I found it. But being scientific minded, I was still critical. I say, well, maybe, you never know, will it last? So I switched back to my original diet. A couple of months later, I tried it again. I had the same effect. And that was it for me. I started and I'm still on it 10 years later. But what I've learned from it, and I'm not proposing that everyone should switch to that diet, certainly not. But I had done research and found studies which focused on traditional diets that existed across the world. And to my surprise, when I first read the book, they were quite different. But what was the very important message that I found in there is that whenever they switched from their traditional diet to the modern diet, Western diet, people started getting ill or more susceptible to sickness. That was the common factor. So when I discovered my diet that worked for me, I wanted to explain why were these people healthy despite having so a different diet. And that is how I found, you could say, the formula, the common factor in these diets. When you look at the different components, food components in that diet, we have the carbohydrates, we have the proteins, and we have the fats. And from the paleo diet, I learned on the energy level that they each have to be balanced out 1/3. I say energy level, I want to stress this, because fats are about the double in energy level as carbohydrates and proteins. So you don't, in weight, you don't need to eat that much fat. And I'm talking about good fat, because there are messages out there that fat is bad for you. But in fact, the studies who proclaim that fat is bad are talking about trans fat, and trans fat is only produced in industrial processing. But if you take good natural sources, you will be okay. So I went back to the other diets and tried to calculate their balance, and I discovered they had the same balance. So that explained why these people were healthy. The key is in the balance. And all you need to do is whatever diet you have, try to aim for this balance. And you will feel that you will absorb more vitamins and minerals. Why is that? Because you eat more proteins, digestion will be a lot slower, and you will have more time to absorb all the nutrients that you need. And why is that important? Because other studies have found out that through the decades, amount of vitamins and minerals in our food has declined. So that's why you need to take care that you have enough time to absorb all the nutrients that we need.
What about supplements then? You said we need vitamin D and vitamin B and things. Can't we just take like a pill, a supplement pill with these vitamins? Wouldn't that help?
Well, I already mentioned some. The fact that there are also synthetic vitamins. And among the supplements that are sold, you will also have these synthetic ones. So you can take them, but it will have almost no effect. So you have to really look at organic vitamins. So look up the information, read the labels so that you can determine whether it's synthetic or not. But in my opinion, we need to get a net from our food. Why is that? Because it's not only the vitamins that we need, it's a whole combination. And what we learn from nature is, whether in plants or animals, there's a whole combination of nutrients, and one supports the other. Because I will take the example for vitamin D. It has to go through different stages in order to be what we call activated. And therefore, we need other minerals to transform from one stage to the other. And in nature, these nutrients are present. So that makes it very hard, if you take supplements, to know and to get the right combination in order to get an activated form of that. And maybe I was talking about diets. Maybe I should talk about some diets that are very popular now today, or are gaining popularity. And I'm talking about the vegetarian or the vegan diet. Why I want to talk about this is that in these diets, you will have a very hard time to get enough vitamin B12 and vitamin D, because most sources of vitamin B12 and vitamin D are from animals and fish. So if you cut them out of your diet, you will have a hard time to get them. Vegetarians could still be okay, because they still eat animal products, milk and eggs. So they will get vitamins from that, at least vitamin B12. Vitamin D can be a problem. And as far as I know, there's only one source for that. And that seems to be mushrooms. So although they are cultivated in the dark, they have vitamin D. We associate vitamin D with the sunlight, but mushrooms succeed in producing vitamin D without any sunlight. So for them, it's very hard to get not only the right balance that I've talked about, but also the necessary nutrients. And as a matter of fact, people who are on this diet or are thinking to switch to that diet should know a lot about food. They should really study food before they either start, or if they are on a diet and they're starting to feel ill, study food, and you will find the necessary information to improve your health, to make that you have the necessary nutrients to have a healthy life.
So, having a healthy life is important. Having a healthy diet is important, especially if you have a brain injury as well, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Maybe there's one point I like to add, because we talked about if you have a brain injury, what you need, but you can also think about the fact, can I do this in order to mitigate the effects in a fume event? And some studies have done that if you have the sufficient nutrients, and specifically I'm talking about vitamin B12, B6, vitamin D, but I would also like to add to that is magnesium and iron. Studies have shown that people who have a higher of this in their blood labs, so they have more in their body, effects of the fume events are less. And you should also think about that when you had a fume event. In that case, it would be interesting to take supplements, the organic ones, which could help you to minimize the effect of the exposure.
That's a good tip, actually, quite important. So thank you very much. That's good information that we're getting out there. Coming back to aerotoxic syndrome, Daniel, what's your take on all of this? Can it actually be avoided, you think? And, having learned from it, has this information changed you in any way?
Well, yes, it has in many ways. And especially after all the messages, emails that I got, the stories that were shared with me, it really hit me. I could imagine that this was a serious problem, but it's only now that I realize how serious it is, how widespread the problem is. And basically, I'm surprised that nothing has been done. And if this was happening in any other industry where safety is paramount, there would be actions. Unbelievable. And what is also important, since these toxins are basically in the same family as nerve gas, and if you know the effects of that, you only have to think about the Tokyo attack in 1995, well, how dangerous this is. To me, it seems what's going on is some kind of weird and dark global experiment that you would read about in a science fiction story. But it's happening, it's real, it's unbelievable.
Amazing. Yeah, I agree completely with you. And in our day and age, it's shocking to realize that the terminology aerotoxic was actually mentioned or published in an article in 1999. And we're still in 2019, we're still trying to prove that there is a sickness called aerotoxic syndrome. They still don't believe it. So, yeah, it's amazing. Daniel, coming back to you now, I'd like to know your motivation. Why do you do what you do? Because you must have a lot of motivation and passion for what you do. So I just want to know where it comes from.
Well, it's a combination of different motivations, I would say. And it also evolved as I discovered more about the aerotoxic syndrome. My first motivation started with the first flight attendant that I saw. I wanted to help her and try to help her defend her case. So, and then I discovered by doing that, I could help many others. That was great. But there are also other motivations. First of all, it became clear to me that this would be very difficult. Yeah, it would be a struggle, but I love a challenge. So that's really motivating to me. I'm also eager to learn, to know more. So that's also exciting for me. I can do scientific research, and I can also show, and that's my experience through the years, that we forget a lot about how important the brain is. We don't think about it and have no clue how important that it is, and we should take care of it because our brain is us. We are our brain. If we don't take care of it, it will change us. We become a different person. And I think many victims from whatever brain injury they suffer, they will know what I'm talking about. They're no longer the same person as they were before. And you could say, I'm also passionate about the brain. It's an amazing, very complex organ. We only know a small part of it, and I'm excited to learn more about it and in that way helping people.
Before we go any further, I'd just like to mention something. I'd like to thank you personally for inviting me to your lab. And I'd like to tell the listeners as well, you were so kind and you actually took me through a walkthrough of your lab, a step-by-step process. You showed me what you do, your research, your results, and so much more. It was truly such an eye-opening experience for me, and my total due respect goes to all the hard work that you do. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you for your kind words.
No, it really was amazing. So before we're nearly ending, coming to the end of the show, which is sad because I'm really enjoying it, all the information I'm getting here. Is there any more information that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, there are a few points I like to mention. We talked already about trying to mitigate the effects of toxins, but I also want to talk about something that many people, not only cabin crew pilots but also passengers, are not aware of, is risk factors that could make them more susceptible to the aerotoxic, and that's brain injury. And brain injury could be considered by some people as minor, having no effect, but that doesn't mean that it is not serious. And I'm specifically thinking about people who are very active in sports, many sports that are dangerous for the brain. We have rugby, football, boxing, all its forms where you get multiple blows to the head. And although they are called subconcussive, that means you won't suffer any ill effects if it remains to that one blow. But if you get repeated blows, and it has become clear, and that's especially become clear in the studies with the National Football League players in the US, that they start to suffer really from brain injury and they are very worse. So why is this important? Because people could be suffering from a traumatic brain injury without knowing it. And I already talked about the secondary injuries. So they don't feel any special problems, or they're minor and they're not putting it to something. You hear a lot of people who are a bit older say, oh yeah, it's my age. It's kind of normal. You can expect that. But it indicates that there are processes running that make them more susceptible to the toxins. Why is that? Because the immune system is compromised, and due to that, that makes them more susceptible to toxins that are in the air. So the risks are a lot greater than you would think, and you might be not aware of them. So that's very important. Another point that I like to mention in risks is for women who are pregnant. They have to realize that if they ingest the toxins into their body, that it will be transmitted to their unborn child. And what's also important is, many people might not be aware of that studies have shown, because we have other chemicals in our bodies now, we're surrounded by chemicals, and studies have found out that we have about 200 different kind of chemicals in our body. And what happens during pregnancy, that the mother dumps about 50% of her toxins into her unborn baby. That's a lot. She will feel better, but it will have its effect on the baby. So that's very important. And then a few points on practical side. First, I like to mention that I will be talking the 10th of May in the Netherlands and organized by Flyaware about my research. So if you're eager to learn a bit more, you're welcome if you can come. And then I also like to call out to one of the people who have emailed me. Why is that? Well, he used an email which doesn't work, so my reply doesn't get to him. So I like to call out to him. I hope he's listening, or someone he knows is listening and would know who I'm talking about. I won't mention his name, but he's a pilot. He's retired since 1969. He lives in Florida, the US. He uses an Outlook email address, and he also, in his career, was also a US Navy fighter. So if you know this person, or if you're listening, please contact me again with another email address so that I can answer your email. And then the last point is, I want to thank everyone who has contacted me, shared their stories. They're amazing. People are very thankful. So I'm thankful that you reached out to me, and also especially to the people who are very ill, are unable to come over to take part, but who were offering to share whatever tests, examinations they had, to share the result, to contribute to my research, to expand my research. It could strengthen the proof that how bad these toxins are for our health. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I just want to reply back to what you just told us. I'm really shocked about what you just said about the linkage between pregnant lady, or the linkage between prenatal and organophosphate poisoning is quite severe and serious, and really it should be looked into. I was also thinking that since you mentioned you're going to be giving a live presentation in Holland, I'm going to be part of that. So I'm coming to see you speak there. But I'll also mention it in the description of this episode. So if people actually want to come, that they have the necessary information on how to come to this event. Coming to the point of contacting you, how can the listeners contact you?
Well, since people are contacting me all over the world, the best way to do that is through email. And the email is aerotoxbrain@proximus.be. If you are unable to write it down, no problem. You will find the email address across many websites, so you can easily contact me.
Yeah, I'll put this email address in the description as well. So, Daniel, the information that you've shared is, I can't even begin to express how important it is. And I would like to have you on at a later date, because I'm sure with the research that you're doing and the more people that you're seeing, you're going to have more findings. So, if you agree, I'd like you to come back on maybe in, let's say, a couple of months, so that we get an update on the situation with aerotoxic syndrome and brain injury and how to work through it.
I would love to come back to give you an update, because not only because I want to share my results, but there also have been a few requests if I would like to set up a newsletter. So people are eager to learn more and to get an update.
Cool, great. So, Daniel, I wish you a very nice evening. And thank you once again for being so helpful and for fighting for the people that don't have a voice. And I hope to speak to you soon.
Okay, it's
Okay.
been a pleasure. Bye.
Oh, my pleasure too. Bye, Daniel.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining the Three Pillars. See you next week.